Recording is on. Welcome everyone to the fourth exciting episode of the SAEON Science Seminars. This month we have Julia Glenday speaking to us. She's a research fellow with the Fynbos node and a hydrologist by training. She's involved in a number of projects with SAEON, but her two main projects are a Water Research Commission funded project looking at comparing different hydrological models that are used in South Africa, and another project looking at the impacts of woody encroachment and invasive species. But I think today Julia is going to be talking to us about hydrological models, and it's a slightly different format in that she's hoping for more of a discussion and feedback and input, and trying to work out how to parameterize evapotranspiration and the vegetation impacts in these models and how they are included in the model. I'm going to hand over to Julia in a second, but just to say that if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat window. You're welcome to, if you have questions of clarity during the presentation, pop them in the chat window, and I will interrupt Julia to explain if needs be. Otherwise, you're welcome to park questions there that she can answer at the end. So I'll kind of make the call on whether it needs to be answered mid-seminar or if she should just address it at the end. And if you don't agree, just say that in the chat window, and then I'll interrupt Julia and ask her to clarify. Okay, so I'll hand over to Julia.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to get my share screen going. Let's see. Is that working now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Great. Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for the introduction, Jasper. And yeah, as Jasper said, we're going to hope to turn over to more of a discussion at the end. But if you need some points of clarity during, please put them in the chat. Also, Jasper, then to sort of unmute everybody at the end. I hope that's possible. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about how catchment hydrological models estimate evapotranspiration. And I hope this sparks some discussion amongst people who are here. A few reasons for this talk in particular, as Jasper mentioned, it links up to a project that I'm doing with the Water Research Commission with a whole team of people on comparing different catchment hydrological models, and then also ongoing efforts by even within SAEON to use observational data to improve catchment modeling. But it also comes from an awareness that others in other fields may well be doing research or collecting observations that could be helpful here if we knew what each other were doing and we were speaking in sort of a common language. Yeah. Oh, I also wanted to mention Michelle helped me a lot also with this presentation, and she's gonna help a bunch of the discussion later. So thanks, Michelle. So the goal of today is to start this dialogue between hydrologists and ecologists, ecophysiologists, remote sensors, other gists, micro-meteorologists, etc. And so I've tailored the talk to hopefully be widely accessible. If you're already very familiar with these models and how they work, this first bit is going to be a bit basic for you. I apologize. I hope that those who are previously unfamiliar with catchment modeling but were interested will leave today with an understanding of how some of the commonly used tools calculate evapotranspiration, or ET. And so you can start to think about the linkages between this and what you do if it applies. So as a bit of motivation, catchment hydrological models are widely used in the South African water sector to help make decisions. They are viewed with a healthy level of skepticism, and there are various levels in which they are applied, and with uncertainty analyses, etc. But they get used in water resources management. So estimating the amount of water that should enter various reservoirs over time, and the uncertainty with that, with the climate variability, and water allocations to towns, agricultural areas, etc., are then somewhat based on these models or historical data or a combination of the two, but they're heavily used in that area. Also in catchment management around They do influence programs and regulations on land cover and management and catchments. So commercial forestry and certain kinds of agriculture are classified as stream flow reduction activities, and the effects of those on particular catchments, some of those estimates come from hydrological models. Looking at invasive alien plants impacts at a national scale relies on some hydrological models. That's been some of the impetus for the Working for Water program. Even municipalities use different kinds of models to look at impervious cover and the impact that it would have on flooding. So how much hardened surfaces are there in a city, and stormwater infrastructure and development regulations are designed around that using those models. So they get used at a variety of scales for a variety of things currently. They're also used for climate change impact predictions, for example. So they can be quite important. They can, improving how they are used can be quite impactful in the real world, is what I'm trying to say. So catchment models have to represent a lot of processes that are going on a catchment. So today I'm just focusing on evapotranspiration. It looms large in our water balance for South African catchments. So we have like a runoff ratio of about 10% mostly. So 90% of the rainfall received evaporates, is what that means. There hasn't been, historically, there wasn't as much direct measurement of ET. And this is now growing. There's a whole lot of new data types to use to estimate ET, which we'll go into. I also saw it as a collaborative entry point for ecologists and ecophysiologists, remote sensors, et cetera, to engage in catchment modeling. So for today, I'm going to talk through an overview of how ET is conceptualized in these catchment models, what parameters they use, the spatial and temporal scales that they're working on, and some examples of field and remote sensing studies that are used to inform modeling, and challenges and some innovative approaches around that. And then hopefully go into discussion, what ideas come up for you when you hear all of this. So as a heads up on the discussion part, please think about how this general approach to conceptualizing and estimating actual evapotranspiration lands with you. Maybe think like your favorite biome, like what would the Namakuru do? Like, is this capturing that? Or how could it? And how can we make use of some of these new data types and emerging research in this context? So as an overview, catchment hydrological models need to simplify everything to arrive at estimates of stream flow and groundwater storage at a certain scale. So the approach to simplification results in what I call a model structure. So the landscape, or the catchment, is broken down into discrete areas, and it's also broken down into vertical layers. And each one of those units, then there are processes that are calculated for those units. And then you also have to decide how the units are connected. So when I say units, it could be a patch of forest or a patch of grassland. A unit can also be a soil layer to a certain depth and several soil layers down to an aquifer. So you have to break up the landscape both horizontally and vertically, and then you calculate processes within units and flows between them. Also need to break up time, so the time steps for which these processes are calculated. And then you also break up the processes, because when I say processes, like, I mean canopy interception, for example, or infiltration of water into the soil, or percolation of water down through soil layers, or root uptake. So those are all processes, but they get broken up into individual steps that are represented by equations and logic statements that we call algorithms. So these things are all linked to each other. The temporal scales and the landscape scales that you use will affect what algorithms, like what mathematical equations are really appropriate. And there are many modeling tools out there that are software programs that allow you to do this, and each one of them has a slight difference in approach. And they're fixed aspects of how you do these, and then some of them have a lot of options about how you do these. So some of the commonly used ones in South Africa, perhaps the most commonly used one given the historical background, is the Pitman model, developed by Bill Pitman in 1973. And this has kind of broken off into two tools that are based on the same set of equations, but have some differences in what they allow you to do. And one is WRSM, the Water Resources Simulation Module, I think is what it stands for. And then another one is encoded in the SPATSIM program from the IWR at Rhodes. And these tools, this model runs at a monthly scale, and it's a bit more lumped and conceptual, so it needs fewer parameters. It's used in the national level water resources studies. It's used in a lot of the water system supply demand reconciliation studies by various consultancies to the Department of Water. Because it runs on a monthly scale, it's more about broad, let us look at reservoir storages and national level studies as well, but it can be run at different scales. And then there's ACRU, which is a daily time step model, and it has more landscape units, so it allows you to represent more vegetation and soil type differences, and its algorithms are a bit more mechanistic or physical. It also gets used in a lot of land cover change studies, climate change studies. And then there are lots of tools out there. Globally, there are heaps of them. Some, I've listed a couple there, and so different academic research, even in South Africa, international partnerships with CMAs or municipalities, they've used different ones. And then, you know, different industries like the mining industry, et cetera, will use different ones because of specific features. So I'm going to focus today on SWAT and Mike Shee because they're used a fair bit in South Africa, but I'll go into that. So to talk through a conceptualization of ET that's general, that's common to all of these tools. And I'm going to focus on ET from vegetated areas. They also do ET from open water surfaces and impervious surfaces and bare soil and rock to the degree that there is. But today I'm just going to look at how it does ET from vegetated surfaces. So that's driven by the atmospheric demand for ET. So that's from the solar radiation and temperature giving the energy for water to evaporate, and then the humidity and the wind are used to estimate an atmospheric demand for ET, and that sets a maximum. But then the actual ET that will happen from the vegetated surface will be curtailed by the amount of water that's actually available and the properties of the vegetation and the soil. So in these tools, I conceive of this in three main processes. So that's canopy interception, which is usually conceived of as a threshold process. So there's a canopy interception storage on the leaves. It can also include the litter catch interception of water. So rain that gets caught on the leaves and the leaf litter that gets stuck on those leaves and leaf litter and evaporates from there rather than moving further down into the soil. And that's generally conceived as a threshold process. So there's a threshold of storage. If it rains more than that threshold, some of it will reach the soil. If it rains less than that threshold, that water will stay on the leaves and the litter and evaporate and not reach the soil. Then there's transpiration from the vegetation. So root uptake and water then passing through the plants and leaving through the leaves. And that's determined in these models by some maximum potential for the vegetation. What would it do given the atmospheric demand? How much ET, how much transpiration would that vegetation type do if it had access to limitless amounts of water? And then it gets curtailed from there by the water storage that's available. And what's technically available is quite a tricky thing to work out. So that's the root zone storage. That depends on how deep are the roots and the properties of the soil and the sediment and the rock that they're in and can reach. And then there's the vegetation response to water stress. So generally vegetation will, when its water available starts decreasing, it starts lowering its transpiration so that it doesn't use it all at once and it has some for later in case it doesn't rain again. And so different vegetation has different strategies for that. And so that has to get represented in the model in some way. And then there's evaporation directly from the soil. And so again, these models set a maximum potential for that based on the atmospheric demand and how much the plants are going to use. And then that gets curtailed again by how much water is in the upper layer of the soil and the retention properties of the soil. So I'm going to talk through some of the parameters that these tools then use to calculate these processes. So how much, if you know how much it rains and what the atmospheric demand is, how much canopy interception, transpiration, and soil evaporation will there be? So for the canopy interception part, often you input a threshold of canopy interception for a vegetation type, or in some cases that's calculated as a function of LAI, which is leaf area index of the vegetation type. For transpiration, to get that max potential that a vegetation type would do if it was not water limited, it's often a coefficient, so it's worked out externally through other studies of what this vegetation type could do if it was not water limited, and it becomes a coefficient, or sometimes it's a function of more ecophysiological studies, I guess. Well, LAI could be sensed at different levels, but stomatal conductance, the actual stomatal conductance of the plants. Then there, to determine how much water is actually available, one has to define the root depth in the model and the properties of that root zone in terms of its porosity and its water retention properties. And then also there's a depth distribution of roots and how much they can withdraw from different depths. And then there are other aspects of whether or not the model allows the plants to access the groundwater, because some models separate the unsaturated zone from the saturated zone and then allow different interactions between those different compartments that were done for calculation purposes. And so there's some method of then reallocating groundwater up to the soil if there's a deficit to represent what's in reality capillary rise or maybe very deep roots of the vegetation. And then there's also the lateral flow of water in the landscape. So there can be water flowing from upslope in the subsurface to reach the soil at a point that would give in that case, there would be more soil moisture than one would predict from the rainfall that fell directly on a given place. So the models vary in how they represent that, whether or not water can move in the subsurface down the slope and reach a low slope area and make that area wetter. And then another thing that has to be parameterized in these models is then that how the vegetation responds to water stress. So how that the ET declines, the vegetation moderates its transpiration as the soil water available declines. And so often that's, you set a threshold and then a shape of the decline for different vegetation types. And then for soil evaporation, some of the tools calculate it all at once, ET transpiration and soil evaporation as one calculation. And then others, they split it off. And then the amount of the ET demand that's met from soil evaporation versus the transpiration can be a function of the LAI. So that would represent shading. So if there's a lot of vegetation cover, maybe there's less soil evaporation because the soil itself is shaded. And then you also define the depth of soil that evaporation is allowed from and the properties of that soil. So there's quite a lot of parameters that these tools use. These parameters and these processes are defined at different scale and calculated at different scales by different tools, spatial scales. So for example, one could calculate it at the subcatchment scale. So that's what the Pittman tools do. So that's where a whole subcatchment, so all the area draining to a stream at a certain point, is considered as one thing. So then your vegetation and your soil parameters are the spatial average of whatever variation is in that subcatchment. So these tools, so the Pittman tools, for example, there are lots of different lumped models. Pittman's not the only one, but as a South African used example, the Pittman tools are often applied at the scale of quaternary catchments. So for a reference, that's 50 to 1,000 kilometers squared. That's the size range of the quaternary catchments. But this tool is also applied for smaller areas as well. Then another way of breaking up the landscape and then assigning these vegetation properties is the hydrological response unit. So then in your subcatchment, for example, you could break it up into areas of different land covers, land cover combinations with soil and topography combinations where you think that area is going to have some consistent properties and responses. So that's what that HRU is. So ACRU and SWOT models use this approach, and some typical sizes for HRUs are, you know, less than a square kilometer up to, I think ACRU sets a maximum HRU size of 30 square kilometers. So for an idea of scale at which you have to define these properties. And then, as I mentioned before, different tools allow these different units to be connected in different ways. In some cases, they all just act independently and flow into a stream. And then in some cases, you're allowed to, the tool can link them such that subsurface flow can reach another downslope area. So that area would then have access to more water. Another way of breaking up the space is a grid cell. And these models tend to be called distributed models. And Mike Shee is an example of a distributed model, or a model that can do run in a distributed way. And that breaks up the landscape into uniformly sized grid cells. And each one of those grid cells can have an independent set of properties if you want, but usually you would input a vegetation map and a soil map, but those don't necessarily need to line up with each other. And then a grid is overlaid on that to get the properties of each individual grid cell. And then those processes that I mentioned in the previous slide would then be calculated at the scale of the grid cell, and the topography would determine how those grid cells are linked in terms of what flows into what flows into what. So that's very computationally intensive. So gridded models are more recent because we have stronger computers. But there's advantages and disadvantages to all of these, not just practically, but also conceptually, in terms of, do things act as one unit, or do they act as these individual units, for example. So to show this in a different way, a more practical way perhaps, here's an example of a catchment with a land cover map at the top. Then if when we're applying the Pitman tool at the catchment, the quaternary catchment scale, this is that same catchment above. It would be broken up into these two quaternary catchments that are quite large, and the entire vegetation would be represented as the average, but then it allows you to have some special modules for irrigated areas, alien vegetation, and wetlands. Then if you were modeling it with ACRU, you could break it up into more subcatchments if you wanted, and then within those you'd have these HRUs representing different vegetation types, and you can link them in a few ways. And then at the bottom, I'm showing you a gridded, this is a very coarse gridded version just to visualize it. But each grid cell then has a vegetation type, and they have a spatial relationship to each other that's defined by their topography and where they are on the map, rather than by you. In some of the HRU models, you need to direct those linkages. So in terms of then the time step, so those processes that I mentioned before, just a reminder, canopy interception, transpiration, and soil evaporation. The amount of each one of those happening in a time would be calculated for a different time step. So in these more lumped models, the Pitman I mentioned is a monthly, and actually behind the scenes, some of the processes are calculated weekly and summed up. But that you look at how much how much canopy interception evaporation is happening in a month, how much transpiration is happening in a month, versus as you get smaller spatial scales, it makes more sense to calculate it at smaller time steps. So you get into daily and even hourly calculations. And then you have to put in these parameters that I mentioned before. So like the LAI and the root depth, and those thresholds of reducing its transpiration for water stress. And one can input those for different vegetation types, either as fixed through time, or they could vary seasonably, or they could vary continuously. So the way I've shown that here on the graph in the upper right is that you could have a fixed property, so it stays the same over time. That graph is just showing an ET coefficient, for example. or in some of the tools, you put it in by the month of year. So it's the same seasonal pattern of parameters in every year, but it varies throughout the year, but it's the same value for each year. Or you could put it in as a time series. So it could be a daily value for the whole time series, or monthly values for a whole time series. So different tools let you do different things. Just because the parameters are fixed, it doesn't mean the amount of ET will be fixed, because the rain is changing all the time, and so the soil moisture is changing. But these are the properties of the vegetation and the soil. So for the ones that are dependent on things like LAI, they can be more variable, but so the canopy interception, the Pitman model, for example, that threshold is the same throughout the model run. In ACRU, it can vary by month of year. In MIC, it's determined by LAI, which can be input as a time series. The other sort of LAI dependent theory can often be put in as a time series. And similar with that ET coefficient, or the stomatal conductance of the vegetation, in some tool in Pitman and ACRU, it's put in month of year. In MIC, it can be put in as a time series. In SWOT, the SWOT model actually uses other factors to model the vegetation's growth. So it estimates LAI for you. You give it a max and a min and a growth curve, but then it will estimate it on a given day using its internal growth model. Similar for root depth. And then there's also those parameters for the shape of the decline of transpiration with water stress. Those tend to be more fixed in all the tools, because it's seen as a more fixed response of the vegetation type that's there. So where do people get these values? When doing these modeling exercises, it really depends on who's doing the modeling, and what setting it's in, and how much time they have to go looking for values for different vegetation types. But in the WRSM and SPATSIM modeling, there are regionalized calibrations. So people have applied the models to quaternary catchments for the whole country and tried to calibrate the models to existing flow data where it exists. So people generally look that up. There's a Water Resources Study 2012, and you can get the model setups for every quaternary catchment in the country, and somebody's made an effort to calibrate it. And you could see if you wanted to use similar parameters for a nearby area, is one approach. For ACRU, it has a built-in database of suggested parameters for a big list of South African vegetation types, including agricultural and indigenous vegetation types, that come from studies, some field studies, and then some extrapolation of field studies to other vegetation types based on their similarity and expert opinion, and then calibrating models in different areas. And that gets updated from time to time, and people evaluate. And then SWOT has an inbuilt database of loads of parameters also for different vegetation types, but one has to be very wary because these were developed in the Northern Hemisphere. And so the growth curve, for example, it's gonna assume winter is in December, and your plants will lose all their leaves if you leave the default parameters, as I found out. And then, yeah, going to literature, remote sensing, and other studies where people have tried to calibrate the same tool in similar environments. People will take parameters from there if they don't have field data in their local area. So that's where these parameters are coming from a lot of times in this context. So I wanted to go then to look at, so now I'm jumping from talking about how the tools work to different studies that are field observational techniques trying to be used, and challenges in using them to try and get these parameters. And so there's measurements people are taking at a variety of scales. So there's an example of heat flux measurements at an individual plant scale. Then there is a surface renewal system and an example of eddy covariance system, and those have different scales of measurement. So just to compare to the scale of measurement, that's the scale that's used in some of the catchment models. So the surface renewal system measures around 10 to 20 meter footprint. And there's some issues about how the canopy interception evaporation is or isn't included in that. Part of it has to do with that when it rains on some of these instruments, which is when the canopy interception evaporation might be happening, some of the sensors are wet at that time, which clouds the measurements. But then there's an eddy covariance, which has a larger footprint, depending on the height of the instrument. Just in terms of, because so that's getting more towards some of the scales of the units used in these different models. So one of the challenges, so some of these smaller scale measurements, it can be tricky to then scale it up to an entire vegetation type. So when measuring one tree, for example, in this example, this technique is well suited to a larger tree, this particular system. But as you can see, there's lots and lots of smaller trees in this patch of vegetation. So is what you're seeing as this bigger tree, how do you scale it to the smaller trees and then the vegetation type as a block? And do we have good ways of doing that? Then one also needs to take into account the time over which these measurements are being taken. So that's shown here in this diagram, that if observational studies are done at an inappropriate spatial scale, you can get the wrong picture of what's happening, and these models are running over the whole time. So, example, if the measurements are taken too far away from each other in time, a sequence of individual measurements, you could miss seasonal or diurnal fluctuations that may or may not be important in the modeling. And then if the study is too short, you may also miss what the observational period is too short. You would also miss longer term trends, and you may not catch the full degree of the variation over time. So it's something to think about with the observational studies, but I think we have a lot more continuous measurement going on, but then the duration of those studies becomes important. Here's another example of now using remote sensing. So remote sensing lets us get over some of the scaling issues in that, in some senses it does. It depends, different remote sensing satellites have different footprints and temporal resolutions, which could come back to this depending on how often and how long you have imagery for. But here's an example of using remote sensing analyses in a creative way that is linked to how ET is conceptualized and represented in models. So these models have to say, okay, what is the root zone storage capacity? How much water what's the total maximum storage of the root zone? And then you look at how much it rained and how much ET there is on a daily basis, and you can estimate what is available, but you do need to put a bound on what is the total amount that could be stored. And it's quite difficult to estimate that, because when you measure soils at different scales, they have very different, the porosity is highly variable, you have maximum macropores, you have different fractured rock. So it's quite hard to actually work out what that root zone storage capacity is. So Savanai and this other paper by Gao, they've come up with a set of analyses that flow from this idea that an ecosystem or a biome that's present is a product of the long-term climate, and the vegetation and soil have co-adapted to that. So in the case of the root zone storage, the effective root zone storage in an area needs to be large enough to allow that biome or that vegetation type to persist through regularly occurring droughts. Otherwise, that vegetation type would not still be there. So then what they did, given that premise, is they looked at NDVI as a measure of greenness versus climate, and they saw what drought period is the vegetation surviving through. And then they worked out, they estimated how much evapotranspiration the vegetation must have done during that period, using some remote sensing tools as well. And they said, okay, well, if it did that much AET when it wasn't raining, the root zone storage capacity must have been at least that amount, and they used that bounding root zone storage capacity in some of their models, and they saw in catchment models, and they saw improvement in performance versus values that were derived from sampling the soil directly. So that's just an example of how, this is a diagram of that where they tested it in different gauged catchments and different types of biomes to look at the root zone storage estimated using this method, and they found different amounts for different climate zones and vegetation types. So that's something that may or may not be relevant in South Africa, depending on how we think different vegetation types respond to drought. Do they completely shut down? Does ET continue in some level, etc.? So it's a way to get parameters that could be useful for improving these modeling tools. There's also a project that I'm involved with, and Michelle and Tony are running and through the ESSRP program, but it's the woody encroachment, and the effort of that project is to use a mix of all these techniques. So plot scale and situ observations of these different processes and remote sensing to try and improve the hydrological modeling of woody encroachment impacts. And then to try and see how we scale up to improve national scale models as well. So we're still in the process of putting all these different elements together. So your input, any ideas is very welcome. So that was a lot of things. To recap, I went through what different models do in terms of how they break up space and processes, and what kind of parameters they need to then represent those processes, and what temporal scales they're using as well. And then some ideas of instrumentation and remote sensing analyses that could be used, or maybe would have difficulty using if we use them in a certain way. But we'd like to hear some of how people responded to hearing that. Did it make sense? If you were thinking about a biome that you studied, do you have an idea of how one might get these kinds of parameters for that biome based on the work you do? And yeah, how can we make use of new data types now that we have all these instruments being put in different places? I'd like to, does anybody have any initial reactions? I'm not sure if I can see the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, I've been monitoring the chat box. There's nothing in there at the moment. If anyone is keen to address a question to Julia or raise an issue, you're welcome to raise your hand or unmute and turn on your video and ask a question. Otherwise, I've always got a few. So Sue has a question. She asks, should a core focus of SAEON or a competency of SAEON be using the same data streams to test different hydrological models? I suppose that's kind of what you're doing with the FWRC project.
Yeah, with that project, what we're doing is we're doing a few different case studies, but each of those case studies is sort of a real world case study that has each one of them has different data available for it. And so it would be a nice question to try and use the same data stream for a set of case studies, which would be something we could potentially do with, it's one you could do with FTON sites, because they will. Yeah. I see Michelle's raised her hand.
I suppose another issue there is just that the different models might require different input parameters.
They do, which is a tricky thing. So we've tried to, in that project, there's a case study that has a set, we're using the same data for each tool, but because they have different requirements and at different temporal scales as well, and they have different algorithms in which they are. So the canopy interception parameter in one tool, maybe you can't actually use exactly the same value in the other one because of how it is, well, the monthly scale versus the daily scale, for example, how it takes into account the precipitation pattern.
Yeah.
Um,
So we've got a few interested questions and people unmuting microphones. So I'm just going to ask one question from the chat box from Sue because it's related. Then we'll take a question from Michelle, and then I'll come back to Tony's question in the chat box. So, so Sue's asking whether there's efforts to develop a SWOT, a background database for SWOT for Southern Hemisphere systems or South Africa.
There's a WRC project ongoing with the University of the Free State and a few others heading it up, but they are calling out to others. And they're actually going to be using, like, as a starting place, they are looking at the ACRU database as well, because there are common parameters there, but there are a lot of differences, and that would need to be tested first. And they are wanting to also look at, how remote sensing and soil mapping can be brought to bear.
Yeah. Michelle, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Jasper. It wasn't a comment, it wasn't a question, it was a comment to Sue's question. And that is, the different hydrological models, although we could use the same data streams to test them, a lot of them have a specific strength or a specific purpose. So you've got to, quite often, you choose a model for its strength and the application that you want to use it for.
Yeah.
You set up sort of Maxi for the entire, well, to set up SWOT, the grid version for the entire country, when you sort of looking at broad scale planning issues, is probably not appropriate. So it's what the model is appropriate for and what you want to use it for.
Okay. Thanks for that, Judy. Do you want to respond, or should I go to Tony's question?
No, I think that's exactly right. So I think we like to go to these more highly discretized models, but there's arguments. Well, first of all, do you have the parameters in the first place? And then there's practical issues, but also in some cases, the things are interacting at a bigger scale, and if you put things in separate blocks, you might not allow the interactions actually happening. So, like, you just have to be careful that you still allow an interaction that's important and is happening. So if you break it down so much, let's say a really big tree is having a hydraulic lift impact or something, and if you break it down to such a small scale that that tree is now in a separate block from something else that it's impacting, maybe that's a bad example, but it could then mean that, and you might represent that with larger scale parameters that are then not sort of directly measured to do with that one tree, but it's measured at the bigger scale.
Yeah, so you can iron out that variance to some degree.
Yeah.
So Tony's question was, from your experience, which parts of South Africa or which biomes have the worst catchment scale models and data? And in other words, which ones need the most attention from researchers?
Yeah, I think, well, because so there's a focus on the ones that are most used for water resources. So those tend to be the wetter ones with big reservoirs. And so I think the drier biomes are perhaps less well parameterized, but they have a lot less surface flow, and maybe a lot of the water that they do have, I think what they need more is the groundwater recharge piece, which the vegetation, what I don't know is depending on how much variance in the vegetation in that more arid zone has on that groundwater recharge or not. How much does it affect infiltration and what recharges, or does all that recharge happen in very heavy events in the vegetation, like it happens very quickly and the vegetation doesn't have as much impact on it, or does it, like, do changes in the vegetation in the very arid zone affect that groundwater recharge, because that's where a lot of the water available later is coming from groundwater. So I would say the arid ones less, but whether or not the vegetation ET representation is that important or not, I'm not sure actually. So
yeah, and you know, there's obviously, if it's not a major water source area, there's typically less interest from funders and government to find out what's going on there.
Yeah, but there are
And the
still
importance of
like
groundwater, I suppose.
ecosystems and people
Yeah.
getting water from whatever small sources they are there. So it would help to know what can impact that,
Yeah.
or what climate change might do to that. So I mean, yeah, but they have received less attention. They've definitely received less attention and less testing. What I'm not sure is how much this vegetation ET piece is or is it more about deeper groundwater processes in that area to work that out? But it's an interesting question because I don't have a good handle on that. So people with more experience in arid zones, if you're on this call.
I had Udhav, I don't know if you have a question. You were unmuted and I had you lined up as the next one, but if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to unmute and ask a question. He's muted. Well, they've muted themselves again. I don't know. Okay, I'll go to a question from Dave, which I might hijack on the way. So, yeah, firstly, he was just thanking you for a very nice explanation. And he was talking about the importance of in-situ observation as the initial input and asking about the typical vegetation parameters that you would measure. So from a plant perspective, is it just plant cover as a metric of canopy interception? And to what extent do you measure these traits? And I suppose this is a question I had written down as well. You know, the importance of leaf morphology. So in Dave's example, you have grasslands with lots of hairy-leaved helichrysums and the like. I'm thinking from a Fynbos perspective of these tiny ericoid leaves versus broad leaves, you know, and how that might affect interception and whether that's accounted for.
Yeah. So, and Michelle, please also jump in here. So with a lot of these parameters, LAI is used a lot. There is effort to take, it's difficult to go from an individual plant to the scales that we're working at. And so then some of the original ones were from sort of larger lysimeter. So a lysimeter was put on a patch of vegetation that measured inflow and outflow, or or measurements were taken at the scale of individual plants and then tried to scale up and then saw what transformations might have to be made to get the model to give reasonable results at the scale you're working at. Because there is a mixture of species and ages, and in a patch one would reasonably be modeling. So because LAI measured at different scales is often used, and then you get into that leaf morphology question. So is LAI enough? Like, LAI doesn't tell you necessarily about the shape of the leaf or the architecture, which the relationship between LAI and that and stomatal conductance, or the ET maximum transpiration rates of a block of vegetation, or the canopy interception might not be so direct. And so some tools assume it is a relationship between LAI, and some tools don't. They ask you to just find out the coefficient in some way and put it in. So that, is done in various ways. And similarly with the root depth, it's quite difficult to measure. It has been measured for different species, and then people look at, okay, somebody measured 20-meter deep roots of this species in this place. Does that make sense for that same species in my place? Sort of, and you have to, then it becomes almost, you define a range based on individual studies, but then it becomes a calibration exercise to some degree. So if there are other ways of getting that information at scale that you're using it could help a lot.
Michelle, you are unmuted. I don't know if you had another question or anything to add.
Just to add to that, so looking particularly at interception, it's one of the sort of least understood. Well, the one variable in the model that has probably the fewest field observations in South Africa that have been done. So there have been a few studies that have been done under indigenous trees and under commercial trees at the scale, sort of to provide the interception loss values, the through flow and the stem flow values. So the typical way, if you have to put in an interception factor, you're probably looking towards the Northern Hemisphere studies that have done that. So there's a big gap as to how we determine the interception values of the types of vegetation we get here. And what Dave's brought up, that's sort of the different leaf properties, how you build that into the model.
Yeah, it's an interesting space because, you know, there's also the issue of fog interception and those kinds of things, and if that's contributing to the water balance. And so those are things that we are actually starting to look at a bit in the Fynbos node, but we should probably actually be doing the basic measurements of canopy interception from rainfall as well.
Yeah, it's a big, how you do it is also very interesting. So we're going to start playing with some very sensitive mini lysimeters in Cathedral Peak to try and pick up the interception. And it's that relationship with the fog is quite crucial as well. So how your canopy interception loss, it's only once that water has evaporated, how your transpiration then comes and what effect it has on the transpiration component of the model is important as well.
Yeah, you know, I have a point that's probably more of a point than a question, and perhaps something, Julia, we should discuss more with Rob and others in the team. But you know, one of the things, so I saw in one of your slides you had stomatal conductance as a function of soil moisture, and that really does get into the kind of what I like to think of the behavioral ecology of plants in their response to reduced soil moisture. Yeah, so there's a lot of these. Rob's done a lot of work on looking at the point of stomatal closure relative to xylem water potentials, which as the measure of stress, and that, you know, you know, talk about P50 and the different kind of levels at which you know, the plant is stressed at the xylem level, and that seems to vary quite a lot. So that's almost like a behavioral decision that the plants are making in some way, that some of them will allow their xylem to become, you know, hit very low water potentials, whereas others will close their stomata much earlier. And so it'd be interesting to try and unpack that stomatal conductance as a function of soil moisture and see if we can make it a slightly more complicated equation and whether that's useful.
What I'd be curious about too is people who are studying that sort of, do they think it could scale up? Like, how would you approach scaling it up, I guess, to a block, like a block of vegetation that has multiple species and different ages? And
does it all come out in the wash, or is it actually important, kind of thing? You know, does it all average out?
Yeah, or I mean, is there a point at which it becomes, like, I think something you guys were looking at as well is like, when is a drought so intense that things start to die? And how, like, is that happening at a species level or like, if it happens at a species level, but that species is quite dominant, how does it affect the rest of the system, the ET from the rest of the system? Or like a whole area of vegetation. Because I think one thing that came up for me, I really liked that, I thought it was an interesting approach, this looking at, instead of trying to measure all the properties, trying to get a handle on large scale soil properties, but using using how much ET actually happened to show how much water the vegetation must have accessed. But I also wonder, this was done in wetter, sort of temperate climates generally. They had one, it was North America, and their other example was a wetter area in Thailand. But I wonder, our vegetation types might react to drought in a different way. They might not just hold on and have low ET. Some of them, well, some of them have, the storage is not in the water, not in the soil. They're succulents and they're storing it inside the plant. And in some cases, I don't know if there's longer dormants, or I guess with some grasses, they just die and then leave seeds and grow again when they can. So I guess if there are different patterns that are unique to, or that are typical of biomes here, that one could use to then infer how some of these processes are happening. A bit like what you were doing with the fire response patterns, Jasper.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Okay, well, I think we should leave it there because we've come to 11 o'clock. Sorry, Mungisi, I didn't mention your comment, but it is a relevant point, just that there's so much complexity in canopy interception, you know, because it also depends on things like rainfall intensity and all kinds of things. But yeah, we should probably wrap up. And so I'm just going to thank Julia for a great talk. If you have any questions or queries or feedback you'd like to send her, please do so by email. She's just julia@saeon.ac.za. So feel free to get in touch or email me as well if you like. And just to say that our speaker next month will be Jenny Jackson-Beach, who will be talking about ocean modeling, and she gave me a better title in an email earlier, but I've forgotten to look it up. But I will share a title and abstract early next week, and for the next talk, which will be the first Friday of December, which I think is the 4th, but I'll have to check. Thank you all very much.